You've tuned in to the unavailing frequency. But don't touch that dial. We've got you right where we want you.
This is Lineage of the Damned, Part 1, The Inheritance of Shadows. My father, Arthur Nolan, died with his eyes wide open, staring at a blank corner of his bedroom ceiling. The coroner called it a massive coronary event, brought on by severe exhaustion and malnutrition. But I knew the truth, even before I stepped into his suffocating, dust-choked house to clear out his belongings. My father was frightened to death by something that wasn't there, or rather something that was only there if you didn't look at it directly. At the funeral, standing in the biting drizzle of an early November morning, I felt numb, not just with grief, but with a lingering, hollow exhaustion. For the last 5 years of his life, Dad had been unraveling. He became a recluse, taping heavy black construction paper over the windows, unspooling long, frantic monologues over the phone about his peripheral vision, that it was infected. He claimed something was standing just outside his line of sight, a presence in the room, a smudge in the air that vanished the millisecond he turned his head to confront it. I begged him to see a psychiatrist. I told him it was macular degeneration or perhaps early onset dementia. I had been rational, cold, and entirely unhelpful. It wasn't until I was walking away from his freshly covered grave that I felt it for the first time. It started as a subtle physical sensation, like the sudden drop in air pressure before a violent thunderstorm. I was walking down the paved path of the cemetery toward my car when my left eye registered a shift in the light. Just at the absolute edge of my vision, where the world blurs into the abstract shapes and colors, a tall and distorted silhouette seemed to be keeping pace with me. Instinctively, I snapped my head to the left. Nothing. Just the manicured lawns, the gray weeping headstones, and the skeletal branches of a dying oak tree. I rubbed my eyes, blaming the lack of sleep, the emotional toll of burying my only remaining family member. But as I settled into the driver's seat of my car and put the key in the ignition, I saw it again in the passenger side mirror. Not a reflection, but a shadow cast upon the window itself. Long, unnaturally thin, vibrating with a frequency that made my teeth ache. I whipped my head around. The passenger seat was empty. The window was clear. The drive home was an exercise in localized terror. Every few miles, a dark, shifting mass would bleed into the corner of my eye. It was never in the center of the windshield, always hovering near the A-pillar or lurking just behind the headrest in the rearview mirror. By the time I reached my apartment, my hands were trembling so violently I could barely unlock the door. I didn't know it then, but the entity had just driven my father into the grave, and it had finally been passed on to me. I am Jesse Nolan, and I am the last of our bloodline, and it is hungry. The first week was defined by denial. I threw myself into my work as a data analyst, staring at spreadsheets until my eyes watered, desperately trying to drown out the creeping dread, but the entity did not care for my schedule. It is difficult to describe what it looks like, because by its very nature it defies direct observation. Have you ever stared at a bright light and looked away, leaving a dark, floating after image burned into your retina? It was like that, but the after image was a gaping tear in reality. It didn't belong to the visual spectrum of our world. When it hovered in my periphery, my brain tried to interpret it as a shadow, a tall man, or a cloak of static. But those were just human approximations to something so profoundly alien. It felt vast, cosmic, and intensely malignant. It was the subtlest haunting imaginable. There were no flying objects, no disembodied voices, no demonic snarls in the dead of the night. There was only the presence. I would be cooking dinner, Chopping an onion in the space just to the right would suddenly feel impossibly heavy. The hairs on my arm would stand up. A cold, metallic scent, like dry blood, would fill my nostrils. And there, just in the corner of my eye, the tall, folding geometry of the thing would loom. "Look at me." It seemed to project these words into my mind, not with words themselves, but with a gravitational pull of pure terror. I would turn and it would be gone, but the dread would remain, coating my throat like ash. Sleep became a battlefield. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, keeping my eyes locked dead ahead. If I relaxed my focus, if my eyes drifted toward the dark corners of the bedroom, I could see it pulling there, a shifting, roiling mass of darkness that seemed deeper than the shadows around it. It was getting closer. When Dad had first told me about his stalker, he said it was always across the street, at the end of the hallway. But by the end of his life, he said it was sitting in the armchair next to his bed. For me, it started in the doorways. By the end of the second week, it was standing right beside my mattress. I began to mimic my father's madness. I removed all the mirrors from my apartment because the entity loved mirrors. Not because it reflected in them, it didn't, but because a mirror expands your field of vision, giving it more peripheral real estate to occupy. I stopped watching television because the reflections on the dark screen were too dangerous. I began walking through my apartment with tunnel vision, staring only at the floor directly in front of my feet. My friends stopped calling. My boss suggested I take an extended leave of absence. I was becoming an island, stranded in a sea of my own growing insanity. I had to know why. If this was a genetic, psychological breakdown, I needed to know the symptoms. If it was real, and God help me, I knew it was real, I needed to know what I was dealing with. I drove back to my father's house, a decaying split level in the suburbs. The air inside was stale, smelling of old paper, dust, and fear. The black paper was still taped over the windows. The house was a tomb. I went straight to his study. The room was a disaster of scattered papers, open books, and frantic scrawling notes. Dad had been a history professor before the curse took his mind. His desk was buried under mountains of legal pads. I spent 3 days in that house, reading through the frantic deterioration of my father's sanity. His early journals from 5 years ago were analytical. He documented the visual anomalies, he called them, with scientific precision, logging the times of day, the lighting conditions, the physical symptoms of nausea and vertigo. But as the years progressed, the handwriting degraded as well. The analytical tone gave way to raw, unadulterated panic. March 14th. It's not a ghost. Ghosts are human. This thing was never human. It feels ancient. It feels like looking up at the night sky and realizing the space between the stars is looking back. August 2nd. It moves when I blink. It gets closer to the center of my vision. If I ever look at it directly, if our eyes meet, I know it will unmake me. I can feel it pulling at my mind. It wants to pull my consciousness into whatever dark, freezing void it comes from. November 18th. I found Elliot's trunk, the attic. I understand now. Oh God, I understand. It wasn't me. It was never me. It's the blood. Elliot, my great-grandfather. I knew very little about Elliot Noland. He was a taboo subject in our family. My grandfather never spoke of him, and my dad only mentioned him in passing as a tragic figure who died in an asylum in the 1930s. I only knew that he had served in the Great War, fighting in the muddy trenches of Europe, and had returned home fundamentally broken. I dropped the journal and looked up at the ceiling. The attic. The air grew intensely dense. The metallic scent of copper flooded the study. Just outside the periphery of my right eye, the tall, shifting mass of static bloomed into existence. It was closer than ever. I could feel its cold radiating against the side of my face. didn't want me to go up into the attic. I forced myself to stare straight ahead at the bookshelf, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Slowly, deliberately, I stood up and walked out of the room, never turning my head. The attic door squealed on rusted hinges. I pulled the cord, illuminating a single dim bulb that cast long, distorted shadows across the rafters. The space was choked with cobwebs and forgotten memories. In the far corner, beneath a moth-eaten tarp, sat a heavy, brass-bound steamer trunk. I dragged it to the center of the room beneath the light. The lock had been smashed open, presumably by my father months earlier. I threw open the lid. The smell of mildew and ancient dried earth wafted up. Inside was a collection of relics from a forgotten life. A moth-eaten wool military uniform, a tarnished compass, several rusted trench knives, and at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, a leather-bound diary and a small, heavy tin box. I picked up the diary. The letter was brittle, flaking off in my hands. The pages were filled with the tight, disciplined cursive that belonged to a bygone era. I sat on the dusty floorboards of the attic, the peripheral shadow of the entity hovering violently in the corner of the room, and I began to read the final testament of Elliot Nolan. October 22nd, 1917. Ypres Salient. The mud here is not just earth. It is a thick living paste of blood, excrement, and shredded iron. We have been digging for 3 weeks. I am a sapper commanded to tunnel beneath the German lines to plant explosive mines. We are moles, blind and suffocating beneath the world, entirely divorced from the light of the sun. Last night my crew and I broke through the clay into something else. It was not a German countermine. It was not a natural cavern. I swallowed hard, turning the fragile page. The entity in the corner of my vision seemed to agitate, its non-Euclidean geometry twisting in a way that made my stomach heave. We broke through the rock and found a hollow chamber. The walls were smooth, perfectly glassy, and angled in ways that made my eyes ache. It defied the natural laws of architecture. The air inside was freezing, smelling of something ancient, sulfur and dead stars. My men, Thomas and Miller, climbed through the breach with their lanterns. They did not return. They did not scream. I waited for 10 minutes in the dark of our tunnel, clutching my trench spade. Finally, I crawled through the breach to find them. The light of my lantern caught the center of the chamber. I cannot write the shape of the thing I saw. It was a fissure in the air itself, a tear in the fabric of God's creation. Through that tear I saw a void of churning, hateful darkness, and emerging from it, anchoring itself to our world, was a presence. It was impossibly tall, shifting and folding in on itself. It had no eyes, but it saw me. It saw through my flesh, through my mind, down to the very root of my lineage. It did not attack, it simply observed. But in that observation I felt a parasite attach itself to my soul, a cosmic leech, drawn to the terror of a fragile human mind. I fled. I scrambled back through the mud, dynamited the tunnel behind me, and buried that chamber forever. But I did not bury that thing. It came back with me. I read on through the night. Elliot documented his return to America, his marriage and the birth of his son, my grandfather. He detailed the exact same descent into madness that my father had experienced and that I was currently enduring. The entity, he theorized, was not a demon in the biblical sense. It was a predator from a dimension utterly hostile to our own. It existed outside of normal spatial dimensions, which is why it could only be perceived at the edges of human vision, where the brain's visual processing is weakest. It fed on our fear, anxiety, and the slow unraveling of human sanity. But worst of all was Elliot's final revelation. November 3rd, 1932. It is getting closer. It no longer waits in the corner of rooms. It stands over me as I write this, but I have realized its ultimate cruelty. It does not want to kill me, not yet. It is cultivating me, like a farmer cultivates a crop. But a single human mind is not enough to sustain it. It feeds on the bloodline. It tethered itself to my DNA in that cavern. When my son was born, I saw the entity linger over his crib. It will wait. It will drive me to the grave, and when my light is extinguished, it will seamlessly pass to my son, and then to his children. It will follow the Nolan bloodline down through the generations, growing stronger, heavier, and closer with each passing life. We are not haunted. We are cattle. We are an inherited food source for a god of the void. And the journal ended there. A week later, Elliot had been committed to an asylum where he starved himself to death in a padded cell, his eyes squeezed tightly shut until his final breath. My grandfather had died young in a car crash, perhaps driven off the road by a sudden terrifying shape in his rearview mirror. Then it passed to my father. For 5 years it fed on his isolation and terror. And now, my father was gone. I slowly closed the brittle journal. My hands were completely still. The panic and the frantic, buzzing anxiety that had plagued me for weeks suddenly vanished, replaced by a cold, laden certainty. I looked down at the rusted tin box Elliot had wrapped in oilcloth. I pried the lid off. Inside was a heavy, loaded Webley MK6 service revolver from 1917, packed in grease, accompanied by a single handwritten note. Break the chain. I sat in the silence of that attic for a long time. The dust motes danced in the pale beam of the single light bulb. The air pressure in the attic plummeted. The temperature dropped so drastically I could see my breath plumbing in the dim light. The scent of chlorine and blood was suffocating. And I didn't need to look in my periphery to know it was there. I could feel it. The entity had manifested fully in the room. It was towering over me, a colossal, shifting monolith of impossible angles and hungry, cosmic malice. It was closer than it had ever been. I was standing directly next to it. Look at me. The pressure and the presence in the room screamed silently. Look into the void. It wanted me to look. It wanted me to meet its gaze, to shatter my mind completely, to begin the long, slow feast that would consume the rest of my natural life. It knew I had no children. It knew that I was the last vessel. I picked up the heavy Webley revolver. The steel was freezing to the touch. I did not turn my head. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead on the dusty floorboards, staring at a small gray spider crawling over a splinter of wood. You're starving, aren't you? I whispered into the freezing air. The shadow at the edge of my vision writhed violently, a silent cosmic rage filling the attic. It loomed closer, the fringe of its static-like form brushing against my cheek, cold as the space between the stars. I slowly raised the barrel of the gun. I will not give it decades of fear. I will not let it feed on my unraveling mind. I am the last of the Nolan bloodline, and the meal ends tonight. I stared straight ahead, took a deep breath, and finally, for the first time since the nightmare began, I turned my head and looked the entity directly in the eyes.